Good morning. My name is Amy Otis DeGrau. I am the Director of International Education here at Hope College. And as Chair of the Board of the Diversity Alliance and on behalf of the full board, I am so pleased to welcome you to the 2014 Summit on Race and Inclusion. I've served on the board of the Diversity Alliance for the last 6 years, and I am so grateful for and proud of the work that the Diversity Alliance has done in our communities along the Lakeshore. Our mission is to dismantle barriers to ensure people of all ethnic backgrounds have equal access and opportunity to participate fully in the life of this community. What a privilege it is to have this incredible resource and organization here in Holland and along the Lakeshore. This morning, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Powell as the keynote speaker. 2 months ago, I had the opportunity to hear Dr. Powell speak at the White Privilege Conference in Madison, Wisconsin. And I know that all of us are in for a very rich opportunity to engage with Dr. Powell as he presents his keynote address, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Others to Form an Inclusive Society. Dr. Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and a wide range of issues including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, and democracy. He is the executive director of the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for change in policy and practice that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomics in California and nationwide. In addition to being a professor of law, and a professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Powell holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor Chair in Equity and Inclusion. He was recently the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University and held the Gregory H. Williams Chair in Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Moritz College of Law. Under his direction, the Kirwan Institute has emerged as a national leader on research and scholarship related to race, structural racism, racialized space, and opportunity. He has been a leader in developing an opportunity-based housing model that provides a critical and creative framework for thinking about affordable housing, racialized space, and in many ways that housing influences other opportunity domains, including education, health, healthcare, and employment. Professor Powell has written extensively on a number of issues, including structural racism, racial justice and regionalism, concentrated poverty and urban sprawl, opportunity-based housing, voting rights, affirmative rights, and action in the United States, South Africa, and Brazil, racial and ethnic identity, spirituality and social justice, and the needs of citizens in a democratic society. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society. Previously, Professor Powell founded and directed the Institute on Race and Poverty at the University of Minnesota. He also served as Director of Legal Services in Miami, Florida, and was National Legal Director at the American Civil Liberties Union, where he was instrumental in developing educational advocacy theory. Professor Powell has worked and lived in Africa, where he was a consultant to the governments of Mozambique and South Africa. He has also lived and worked in India and done work in South America and Europe. He is one of the co-founders of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and serves on the board of several national organizations. Professor Powell has taught at numerous law schools, including Harvard and Columbia University. Now, I know that you are eager to hear Dr. Powell speak, so would you please help me in joining him in welcoming Dr. Powell to Holland and Hope College as he presents his keynote address, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Others to Form an Inclusive Society.
Good morning. So first, let me thank Gail and and the Alliance for all the work you've done here and you do in Western Michigan that affects the entire country. Let me also thank all of you for joining us this beautiful morning, and then thank all of the sponsors. So also I want to thank my colleagues and friends. This first row here looks like my family. In fact, it is my family. Really a great group of people. So I feel like I really don't have to say anything, because whatever I don't say, Manuel Pastor will say, or Susan Eaton will say, or Alvin will say, or Phil. Anyway, it's a great group of folks. You get to hear them all day. And really some of the most thoughtful people who've been working for years to try to make this a fair and inclusive society. So I'm going to be talking to you about implicit bias. Let me make sure this works. So if you notice the first slide, it says dismantling unconscious bias. Actually, we're not going to do that. So those of you who have unconscious bias, like all of us, today is not going to try to dismantle it, but really talk about how it works and some things we can do to manage it. I remind people, and I'll be saying in my talk today, that having bias, what we call bias, is actually doesn't make you a bad person. It actually makes you human. The way the mind works, we are constantly engaging in things called stereotypes and in bias. The problem is when those biases and stereotypes undermine our explicit conscious values. So the real question is, how do you manage bias? And it's not just bias that we're concerned about. We're concerned about our behavior and outcomes. So if you had bias and it didn't affect anything, just it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But when we have biases that are impactful to our work, impactful to our society, and impactful to our family in ways that we don't intend and that undermine our goals, that's when it becomes a problem. So in many instances then, what we're concerned about is behavior. And what we know is that what we call implicit bias actually affect our behavior. And this is actually along virtually every axis, not just along the axis of race, but gender, age, disability. We're impacted by what's called implicit bias. And we have both implicit and explicit. And they don't move together always. So sometimes what we want to do explicitly is inconsistent with what we actually do implicitly. And when there's a tension between the implicit and explicit, usually the explicit loses and the implicit wins. So what do we mean by implicit? So sometimes you hear the term unconscious bias. So years ago, I studied psychology at Stanford, and we learned about Freud and the unconscious. What I'm talking about today is Freud would not be happy with. We like Freud, but we're sort of done with him. So the unconscious, one way of talking about implicit, is that implicit is what we're not aware of. But we cannot be aware of something, and we can actually call it into awareness. Sometimes that's called preconscious or subconscious. And then there are things that we're not aware of that we can't call into consciousness. That's really what people call the unconscious. So implicit basically means anything that we're not conscious of. So some of those things we're not conscious of, if we try to, we could become conscious of. So for example, as you sit there being enthralled by my brilliant remarks, you probably are not thinking about what you had for dinner last night. So it's not conscious. But if you find that, actually, this guy's not so brilliant, you might start thinking about what you had for dinner last night. Then you're calling it into conscious. But here's an example of something that's unconscious. I'm going to give you 10 seconds, and I want you to try to become conscious of the neurons firing in your brain. Time's up. Okay. And I'm sure I had no successful efforts out there. Now you might say I only had 10 seconds. So when you go home, take 2 hours, take 3 days. You can't become directly aware of the neurons firing in your brain. We can become aware indirectly, and we can actually see it through other processes, but we can't become aware of it directly. So that's unconscious. And no matter how hard we try, we cannot gain access to that. So what happens when the conscious and unconscious actually are in conflict? So I do this often. Some of you may have seen me do this before. I'm going to ask you to, I used to say shout out the colors as soon as you see them. But with 700 people here, I'm going to say whisper. Or just say the colors as you see them. Now you'll see some letters as well. I want you to ignore the letters. All I want you to do is say the colors. Okay? I know it's early in the morning. So let me just talk to you about what just happened. I told you to ignore the letters. And this actually, you can't ignore the letters. Your unconscious is actually always online. So when you go to sleep at night, it's still online. You can't turn it off. And so sometimes there's tension between your conscious and your unconscious. And when there's tension between your conscious and unconscious, it often slows us down. There's a conflict. I'm trying to actually say red, but I'm seeing the color red, but I'm seeing the word blue. And the unconscious gets tied up, the mind gets tied up. And when that happens a lot, we have what we call cognitive depletion, when there's a conflict between our conscious values and our unconscious values. And we've actually can do this online in something called the implicit association test. You can go online and take a test. And what this test will do is that you'll sometimes see good words that are positive, and you're to identify those words as quickly as possible. And we find that for most Americans, when they see a positive word and a picture of a black man, they can't identify the word as fast. It's like seeing red with the color blue. Now, that's actually true for most of us. Even black people oftentimes have a hard time associating positive images, positive words with black images. So this is a little bit counterintuitive. The unconscious is social, meaning that society builds up associations through movies, literature, and those associations affect all of us, not just white people, all of us. So we find that, for example, women have difficulty having positive associations with women in math, similar to men. Not as high as men, but they have that as well. The unconscious is interacting and reading the larger environment. So when we see these associations, when we find out we have these tensions, it doesn't make us a racist. It doesn't make us sexist. It means we are reflecting the larger environment. But it also means that it can affect our behavior as we move through life. Now, the thing about unconscious bias is that because it's unconscious, we're not aware of it. So we have to find some other way of actually measuring it. And we have these tests to do that. So if I asked you, how much do you weigh? Most of you wouldn't know, the rest of you wouldn't tell me. So better than asking you what you weigh is to say, here's a scale, step on the scale. And some of us would be surprised at what the scale tells us. Many of those scales are wrong anyway. So that's what we're trying to do, and this is different than Freud. Freud didn't have access to ways of measuring the unconscious. He speculated about the unconscious. He was analytic about the unconscious. Now we have empirical data in terms of what's going on in the unconscious. I should also say, when we talk about these different categories, these categories aren't natural. We might think, well, it's natural for black people to be with themselves, or not, and white people to be with themselves. It's natural to want to be with your own. It's natural to associate with people like you, except it's not natural to know which group you're in. Groupings and the meaning and impact of groups is largely social. So there's no natural division between people based on their race, based on their religion. Society tells us what's important and what values to attach to that. So when you were being introduced to me, you were told I lived in Africa. My oldest daughter was born in Africa. And when I was in Africa, I lived in a village, and people actually didn't notice and didn't particularly care about your phenotype. They don't care if you're light or dark. What they do care about, though, is what tribe you're from. And so I was there, and people would say, "So what tribe are you from?" And I said, "I don't know." And it didn't make sense to them. They categorized the world in terms of tribes. And so that was not an acceptable answer. So they kept saying, "Now, you have to know what tribe you're from." And I said, "How do I suppose to know what tribe I'm from? You know, I'm African American." "Oh, that's your tribe." Then they were happy. And so each society does this differently. And in the United States, race, gender, and some other things are very salient. So if I was giving this talk in the 1980s or 1990s, and it may surprise some of you, yes, I was here in the 1980s, I would be talking about prejudice and how you actually manage prejudice and how you get rid of prejudice, and be talking about Alpert's book, The Nature of Prejudice, written in 1954. And we would be trying to overcome prejudice. We'd all be talking about, we want to just see each person as individual. We don't want to have stereotypes. We don't want to have prejudice. But it's not 1980, 1990. It's 2014. And today, we actually don't believe we can overcome prejudice. We don't believe we can overcome stereotype. There's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. The fast part of thinking is the unconscious. The slow part is the conscious. The fast part of thinking is the unconscious. The unconscious is super fast. And the conscious is very slow. And the idea of controlling the unconscious simply will not happen. The unconscious is huge, and the conscious is small. By some accounts, we process 40 bits of information a second consciously. So some of you may say, well, what's a bit anyway? Ask your computer. When we talk about bits of information, we're just talking about discrete pieces of information. So we process about 40 bits of information a second. During that same second, while we're processing 40 bits of information consciously, we're processing 11 million bits of information unconsciously. So almost all the work is done at the unconscious level, and it's huge. And so the unconscious is doing virtually all the work. In fact, some social scientists say the conscious is a fraud, because we think we're making a decision consciously. It's really the unconscious that made the decision. It sends it to the conscious, and the consciousness adopts it and say, I made the decision. Actually, the committee made the decision, called the unconscious. And so we can't really control the unconscious. We can become aware of it, and there are things we can do to impact it, but we can't really control it. Now, the unconscious does a lot of work. And one of the things it does is it fills in gaps. So just a show of hands, how many of you see a triangle up here? Okay? And you'll be pleased to know there is no triangle. And if you covered up one of your eyes or closed one of your eyes, you would see a complete field. And yet, all of us have been to an eye doctor, and we know that we have a blind spot Why don't we see that blind spot? It's because our unconscious doesn't like blanks, so it fills it in. So we see a complete field, even though there is no complete field. Another interesting factoid, you see depth. You see people behind you and people before you. Your actual vision is flat. The reason you see depth is your mind actually insert depth. But your actual vision, in terms of the light being projected onto your back into your eye, is actually two-dimensional, not three-dimensional. The only reason you see three-dimensional is because your mind sees it. And so the unconscious actually orders what we see, affects what we see, and helps us process information. And where the information is missing, it actually fills in the information. And there's a way in which the unconscious make associations. When two things happen over and over again, we actually build a neural network between those two things. They become connected. Those habits become literally physically connected in the brain. So we've all heard of Pavlov's dog. What's the relationship between ringing a bell and food or salivating? None. There's no relationship between a bell and eating. But you ring a bell, you feed the dog. You ring a bell, you feed the dog. After a while, all you have to do is ring the bell, and the dog starts salivating. The dog is actually making a neural connection. And I'm not saying we're dogs, but in fact, that is the way our brain works. We make these connections at an unconscious level. We don't even think about them. The connections we make, again, are largely social. So I'm going to give you this awareness test, and those in the back, if you can help in terms of running this test. Hopefully there's sound.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Okay, so I take it from your laughter that some of you didn't see the bear. So let me tell you what was happening. This is called priming, and we're primed all the time. So I said you can process 40 bits of information a second consciously. We have some discretion, not unlimited discretion, in fact, very little discretion in terms of how we actually use that 40. We can direct our attention to one thing or the other, but we can't see everything. So when you're counting and watching the team in white, you've exhausted your 40. Anything else that comes across your vision, you don't consciously see. You actually unconsciously still process it, and we can actually measure that. That's called priming. Now, an example. So this is pre-consciousness, right? Because you could watch the bear. You could become conscious of the bear. And some people who've seen this before will actually, they're looking for the bear, but they're not counting. You know, so it's like you count or you look for the bear. It's hard to do both. So when you came in this morning, if I asked you, what was the color of the car in front of you at the second stoplight? Most of you can't tell me. On the way home, you could say, I'm going to pay attention to that. I'm going to notice the car at the second stoplight in front of me. I'm going to notice the color of that. But now you're not listening to your wife or your husband talk. You sort of, you're using your 40 in one way or the other. And so we're primed all the time. We're told what to notice. We're told what's important. And it matters in terms of issues in terms of racial justice, fairness, and inclusion. And these things happen very fast, and they happen before we realize it. So the unconscious is sorting, is making associations, is telling us, is picking out certain things that are important. In this process of collecting things together, we sometimes call schemas. Now, schemas are not good or bad, they just are. We make these connections in the mind, and we experience them as being real. And most of the time, again, we're not even aware that it's actually happening. So when we talk about bias, we're actually, again, reading what's happening in the larger environment. If we're going to address this bias or manage it, there's some interventions we can make at the individual level, but there's some we'll need to make at the larger level. There's a concept called stereotype threat. We just got a new provost at UC Berkeley named Claude Steele, and he does work around something called stereotype threat. And it's actually quite amazing, this work. I'll just take a minute to describe it to you. So, and all of us can be exposed to stereotype threat. So here's one threat that he uses. He'll have a group of graduate students at Stanford, and he'll say, these are Asian American women, and he'll say, I really love teaching here at Stanford because there's so many bright women. And then 15 minutes later, he gives them a math exam. And they basically bomb on the exam. They don't do well. The second group, who has exactly the same ability, he brings them in and he says, I love teaching here at Stanford because there's so many bright Asian American women. He gives them a test and they ace it. Both groups have exactly the same ability. The first group, he's primed in terms of their womanness. He's reminded them that they're women. And they know in our society that we believe women cannot do well at math. And this puts pressure on them at an unconscious level, and this pressure and this dynamic actually caused them to confirm the stereotype. They underperform. The second group, same ability, this time he reminds them of their Asian Americanness. And we have a stereotype in our society that Asian Americans are good at math. So then they perform consistent with that stereotype. He does this for every group. He has one group where he has black men and white men playing golf. But before he has them play golf, he says, you know, some people think golf is a physical game, but it's really all mental. It's all strategy. Now the white guys exceed. They do extremely well. The second group, same course, the same ability, but now he says, you know, people think too much about golf. It's all natural ability. Now the black guys exceed and the white guys bomb. So the thing is that and this is called priming. So again, we're being primed all the time. And in this priming, we end up confirming oftentimes or stereotypes that we unconsciously are aware of. Now in terms of talking about implicit bias, as I said, is interacting with the larger structures. It's interacting with society. So we actually have to be aware of the structures themselves. Implicit bias is not just something that happens between our ears. It's interacting with the environment. So we may think that our goal here in Western Michigan and our society is to treat everybody the same. But I want to suggest to you that's not our goal. Our goal is to treat people fair. Our goal is to be inclusive. And people are not situated the same within structures. So we build an escalator to get people to the third floor. Everyone can now get on the escalator and get to the third floor. But here comes a guy in a wheelchair. What do we need to do for him? It turns out that he needs an escalator. The structure is actually discriminating against the guy in the wheelchair. And so we have to think about the message and who are the structures actually benefiting and whose structures are not benefiting. And there are hundreds of examples like this for every group. Because we're situated differently within structures, we need to pay attention to that difference. If we want to get people to the same outcome, we can't treat them all the same. So another example, let's say I have a headache, and Manuel has a headache. So they both have a headache, we're going to give both of them an aspirin. But Manuel's headache is caused by, he came from California, he had to get up very early to come to an event, he's tired, give him a headache and give him an aspirin and some coffee. My headache is caused by, maybe I have some serious disease, maybe I have cancer. So the manifestation of those look the same. Both of us have headaches. But the underlying cause, the subject, is actually quite different. So the way you treat those need to be different. Let me give you a real example. We're working with a number of school districts around the country. And a number of school districts have been cited for the way you treat black boys compared to white boys. And so on one hand, you might say, you should treat black boys and white boys the same. If black boys act up, they should be treated a certain way. If white boys act up, they should be treated the same way. But here's the rub. We know that black boys in the United States, especially in urban areas, are 7 times more likely to be exposed to trauma than white boys. Trauma creates a medical condition. So now you have a black boy who's acting up, but not because he didn't have breakfast this morning, but because he's been exposed to trauma. The intervention for a trauma victim and intervention for someone who didn't have breakfast this morning is not the same intervention. So even though they look like they're behaving the same, the cause of it is actually quite different. And sometimes we don't see that. And so again, the goal is not to treat everybody the same because people are not similarly situated. I'll give you one last example that's quite important. I taught at Ohio State University excuse me, Buckeyes, for a number of years. I'm almost 6'4". So when I first went there, Ohio State had a rule, and the rule was applied evenly to everybody. The rule was, if you're traveling on university business, you rent a subcompact car. And I said no. And initially they said, Professor Powell is a prima donna. Everybody else rents in a subcompact car, and they don't complain. He's complaining all the time. And I said, I'm not just complaining, I'm not going to do it. They couldn't see that I was 6'4". And they said, this is the rule, we've had it in place forever, no one's ever complained. And I said, I'll bet you a dime to a donut that the person who put this rule in place is under 6 feet. But again, they weren't seeing that. All they saw was we have a universal rule, we treat everybody the same, whether you're 5'2" or 6'2", we're going to treat you the same. So part of the thing in terms of structures is to see how we're situated within structures. And structures carry information. Structures actually benefit some people and not other people. And we have to notice the work they're doing. So if you're trying to actually be fair and inclusive, you have to be aware of the work that these structures are doing. Now, we can talk about in terms of race, we could talk about in terms of gender, we could talk about in terms of age, disability. We're all situated differently within structures. So these mechanisms that can create barriers can happen at the unconscious level and can happen in large society through structures. It's not dependent upon individual animus. We're not saying the guy who built the escalator hated people in wheelchairs. But still, the escalator discriminates against people in wheelchairs. So we have to be aware of the outcomes and the work that these structures are doing. So as you think about being fair and inclusive, you have to look at what's going on and be aware that there may be both implicit biases operating, but also there may be structures that are keeping people out. And again, for good reason, we want to treat people fair, but sometimes we think treat everyone the same. So structures actually help us understand how people are situated, but only if we look for them. And oftentimes, we don't see structures. We don't see the work that they're doing. We just see individuals. So there's an interaction between the structures and the mind. Again, I'm at the University of California, Berkeley. My daughter went there a few years ago. It was great. I was glad to have her. It was wonderful to have her on campus. It wasn't great that because she was an out-of-state student, it cost $50,000. And so I said, well, Sunita, maybe you already have enough schooling. But here we have essentially money actually discriminating. We find out a lot of Black and Latino students who can get into schools like the University of California, Berkeley, don't have the money to pay. Many students don't stay in school because they have to go work for their family. So it looks like the two students are the same. They're both good students, they're both strong students, they're both A students, but there's a background that's quite different. And so the structure actually then may push them out. Once it pushes them out, if that happens a lot, we're likely to make some association. Black students don't stay in schools. Latino students don't stay in schools. They don't care about schools. We end up having a story that actually don't see the structures. So we have to understand the role of structures and systems and how that actually can produce a different set of outcomes. There was a story some time ago about a famous person, and I won't mention Clarence Thomas's name, but he talked about his sister not being a real go-getter, not like him. You know, he went to school, he went to Yale. I went to Yale too, he's a year behind me there. But his sister dropped out of school, and he disparaged her. Now here's the backstory he didn't tell you. His sister dropped out of school because the mother got sick. She dropped out of school to take care of the mother. So he told part of the story, which made him sound, and he was the hero of his story, and his sister was the villain. The reality is, when we hear the whole story, it's like, well, that's actually kind of a good thing, to sacrifice and take care of your parents. So they were situated quite differently, and the outcome was quite different. So it's important to understand how we're situated within structures. So again, we're talking about looking at what lessons the structures are, the repetition, what associations we're creating in society, and how those associations both get played out in the unconscious and how those associations affect us in real life. So here's one of the examples that I like to use. If we show a subliminal picture, that is, a picture where it flashes so fast that the conscious mind can't read it, of a black man, a black face, our ability to actually recognize a gun increases. We show a picture of a gun that's sort of disfigured, so you can't really tell it's a gun, except when we've seen a subliminal black face, our ability to then identify gun increases. Because one, the unconscious is fast, it recognizes the face. Two, there's an association between those two. So let me talk a little bit about networks. Again, why we don't just treat everybody the same, why that's not the same as fairness. We all want to be fair, but treating everyone the same is not the same as being fair. So the CDC did a study, and Brian Smedley is here, and he may talk more about this later, but the CDC did a study on young black kids and young white kids who were engaged in sexual behavior. The interesting thing is they were engaged in exactly the same behavior. The frequency, the use of protection, everything was the same, except the outcome. In this case, blacks were much more likely to contract sexually transmitted disease. And initially they were confused. Like, they're behaving the same as this group. Why is there a difference in outcome? And what they found to be the difference was their networks. the networks actually, the way the disease traveled didn't depend on individual behavior, but depended on the networks they were in. Now, all of us who've had young children will know this because, we protect our children, get them up in the morning, give them orange juice, make them breakfast, wash them up. At least that's the goal. And then we send them to school. If they're in a school where they're exposed to disease, they are more likely to bring home a cold. Not because of their behavior, but because of the network they're in. And so networks actually carry information. And different groups have different networks. We can actually plot networks right now. Think about jobs. 85% of jobs is word of mouth. So I go to school, Alvin goes to school, we both work hard, we both look in the newspaper for jobs, but Alvin has a network where jobs are being circulated. My network, jobs are not being circulated. I simply don't find out. So think about Western Michigan and the networks we're in. And the networks we're in are largely racialized. Most of the people I know look like me. Most of the people you know look like you. And no one's trying to discriminate, but the network itself is distributing opportunity based on who we know and who we don't know in power. So recently we were contacted by a group in Silicon Valley, a small group, I'm sure you haven't heard of it, I think it's called Google. They actually have an incredible project. They actually have a contest where the contest is who can build a ship to the moon, to take a robot to the moon, to take an excavation, to analyze it, and send the data back to the United States. That's back to Earth, not necessarily the United States, but Silicon Valley. And if you win this, you get a ton of money. And they have, I think, 15 countries and about almost 20 groups competing. And then they noticed that almost everyone in the group is male. And so one of their subsidiaries contacted us and said, we want to make sure diversity is actually included. Sort of an afterthought. Why is it that all the people involved are male? Most of them white, some of them Asian. And they're saying, there's something here that maybe we should look into. So we're actually helping them, beginning to help them think about this. But we actually know, again, that networks matter. So in Silicon Valley, which is predominantly male, white and Asian, here's one of the things that happen. You have these young, usually bright kids working hard, and they're trying to create a new app or something, and it gets to a certain point. And you actually have blacks and Latinos in Silicon Valley too, creating new apps, gets to a certain point. Now I want to sell it. How do I do that? I go find a venture capitalist. And what we found is that venture capitalists actually circulate in a network. It's not like going to Bank of America. It's like, who do I know that has $5 million that they could invest in me? And I can tell you, I don't know anyone. Maybe Manuel, you invested? No, he said no. So that's a network. Again, two ideas, maybe get to the same point, but now I need somebody that I know or somebody that a friend of mine knows who's going to invest in $5 million in me. It turns out that many people from the Black and Latino community, they don't know those people. And so they don't have venture capitalists. And so we actually worked with a group to actually create a venture capitalist fund that would be available to people who are not in the network with a lot of money. So networks matter. So again, we don't see this because we look at individuals and we think everybody can do everything. So I've already covered this, so I'm going to keep going. So when we talk about these processes at the unconscious level, in terms of systems, structures, in terms of networks, we can't stop them. We can't not have networks. We can't not have structures. We can't stop implicit bias. These things happen, and they happen very fast. And if we actually tried to slow the world down so that we could process it at 40 bits per second, right? I'm going to be deliberate about everything. First of all, it's exhausting, right? So I remember when I was 15 and learned to drive. My dad took me out, and I wanted to learn how to drive, so I wasn't a reluctant driver. I grew up in Detroit, and so my dad took me out, and we're driving, and he said, "Okay, John, go a little faster." And I'm saying, 15 is plenty fast enough, Dad, you know. But the world was coming by so fast, and you know, after about 15 minutes or 20 minutes, I'm perspiring, I'm concentrating, I'm trying to process everything consciously. And then my father said, "Okay, you're doing well. We're going to go on the freeway now." It's like, no, right? Because I couldn't process all that information consciously. When the conscious tries to process so much information, it just gets overwhelmed. And now, you know, I can drive on the freeway, you know, 80 miles an hour. I don't drive that fast, except occasionally. You know, drinking my coffee, listening to the radio, talking on the phone. Now, I'm probably doing too many things, texting, right? No, I don't text. I tweet, but I don't text. No. The point is that a lot of that information has been consigned to the unconscious. And so the unconscious is processing it very fast. And so now I can do a lot of things. It's become habituated. The unconscious, these associations has become habits. And habits is something we can do without thinking about them consciously. But if we tried to do all of this at the conscious level, it would not only slow us down, we would not survive as a species. We would not survive. So the unconscious is doing a lot of work. We don't want to take it offline. What we want to do is see if we can actually do things so that it aligns with our conscious values. So they've done these shooter tests where they take police and they put them in stressful situations and they are told to react very fast. Turns out that when the person is black, the police is more likely to shoot them when they have a cell phone. They make a mistake because they have an association of black and violent and gun. Black guy must, now this is not a gun, I wanted to make it clear, and they overshoot the black person. Now, I should again add that black police actually do it too, because they have the same association. They may not do it as badly as white police, but they do it too. They're reading the environment. The good news is we can interrupt that. Through training, through interventions, we can actually train police to actually see the gun and see the cell phone and distinguish between them. But it takes training. It doesn't happen naturally given our environment. And so the question then becomes, can we do this across the board? Can we create mechanisms to disrupt the unconscious bias that's actually, in this case, impairing our lives? When this happens, our first impulse, police shoots a young black kid, it's a tragedy. We should feel the tragedy. The kid didn't have a gun, the kid had a cell phone. The first impulse would be to say, well, the police must be racist. And I'm suggesting that not necessarily. The police is reflecting the larger environment, something that most of us would do most of the time. Again, we can actually disrupt that, and we need to think about how to disrupt it. But it's important whether we call the police a racist or not. Because the good news in our society, nobody wants to be racist. Not even owners of basketball teams who don't like Magic Johnson. So what we're trying to do, though, is get people into the conversation, and we're saying, you're not a bad person, I'm not a bad person, but bad things are happening. Kids are getting shot. People are being locked out of systems. People are being segregated in schools. How do we change that? And we're not saying you're bad, but we're saying bad stuff is happening, stuff that's happening inconsistent with our values. The same is true in terms of doctors. And I tell this story, true story. About 4 years ago, I got assaulted on the mean streets of Columbus. And I went to my doctor, and I had several broken bones and ribs, and I was in a lot of pain, and I had been seeing my doctor for years. And the doctor said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Awful, I'm having a lot of pain." And he said, "Well, okay, here's a couple of aspirins, go home, take it easy." Took some x-rays. The next day he called me up, and he's yelling at me. And the reason he's yelling at me, frankly, is because he has guilt or shame. He's a white doctor, but he's like a friend. And it's like, why didn't you tell me you were in pain? He's looking at the x-rays. And x-rays is showing these broken bones and broken ribs. And he's realizing he didn't give me the appropriate pain medicine. And so he doesn't want to be a bad doctor, so he makes me the bad patient. You should have told me you were in pain. I said, I did tell you, but you were so calm about it. Come back in here. And again, so whether we're talking about police or doctors or teachers, we're all the subject of implicit bias. And there have been studies after studies in terms of different medications for people of different races. But we can change that. We can do better. The same is true in terms of hiring. If you have an Arab-sounding name, you're 3 times less likely to be called back with exactly the same resume. And again, it's not that the people who are saying, let's go through the powell and take out all the Arab-sounding names, but we have this association. And there's a recent study where they send out a memo with a certain number of mistakes on it, and they have some people in a law firm read it. And if it's a black-sounding name, they mark it up, and it's like, this is a terrible memo. Where'd you go to law school? And just, the white-sounding name is like, well, this doesn't work, but this is very smart. And again, these are partners in a law firm. No, I don't believe, explicit bias, but clearly implicit bias that will affect the hiring process. So how do we, again, get a handle on things like that? Thank you. So I've been talking a lot about how implicit bias affects black people, Latinos, people with disabilities. Let me talk a little bit about how it affects white people. See, my slides are off, so I don't know where I am. So we don't want to be racist. And just like a stereotype threat can happen where someone's trying to do a test and actually avoid a stereotype, which actually caused them to underperform, when white people are in a situation where they're really trying hard not to be racist, not to notice race, it actually can create cognitive depletion and anxiety. So colorblindness simply doesn't work because while the conscious mind may not be seeing color and doesn't want to see color, because if I saw color, if I saw race, it would make me a bad person. I'm not a bad person. The unconscious mind is unruly. The unconscious mind is politically incorrect. It's like, you may not be seeing race, but I noticed that guy's black, and we've having a meeting about it, and we decided, there's a memo going back and forth, we're not hiring him. And then, so you can imagine, think about the red color and the red word. Trying not to see race all day is exhausting. It creates a lot of anxiety. I sort of jokingly say, the husband comes home at night and the wife says, how was your day? I say, it was exhausting. I was not seeing race all day, And actually we can measure, it creates anxiety in white people and a discomfort. It's nothing to do with race, I just didn't like that guy. It made me uncomfortable. We didn't click. And it had nothing to do with race. And the conscious mind can be telling the truth as far as it knows. But the unconscious mind can actually be taking over and producing outcomes. So anxiety, and I think, I'm way off now. The anxiety that's produced when you have a diverse situation, oftentimes is not talked about. And it's not just anxiety for the quote-unquote targeted minority, it's anxiety for the dominant group. So you're here in Western Michigan where whites are still in the majority, at least for the next 3 days. And then there are people coming in who don't necessarily look like you, who don't necessarily eat the same food as you. And I believe you wouldn't be here if you weren't concerned about these issues. But at some point, there may be underlying anxiety. And unless we can actually talk about this anxiety and acknowledge this, it's actually likely to act out in some unproductive ways. There's a scholar named Robert Putnam. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. He asserts that not just in the United States, and Manuel will talk about this later, but all over the United States and Europe, diversity is exploding. And diversity that's actually salient, that is, people notice it, because there's always diversity, where there are people who talk different, people who eat different, people who have a different religion. And it's creating, according to Putnam, it's creating mass anxiety, not only in the United States, but in Europe. And people act out. And so there was recently a guy who's running for Prime Minister of England. He was talking about all these immigrants in England, they're threatening the country, and maybe we need new immigration policy. And someone said, but sir, your wife is from Germany. He said, I'm not talking about those kind of immigrants. True story. I mean, it's like, what kind of immigrants are you talking about? And what he's really doing is tapping into that anxiety. What I want to suggest is that we have to have a platform to be able to acknowledge and talk about the anxiety, to make it so that you're not a bad person when you're dealing with people who are different than you. That doesn't make us a bad person. So a month or so ago, someone came to my office and they were paraplegic. And I live in San Francisco, and it's the heart of political correctness, and we try to open our arms to everybody. So the guy comes in, they wheel him in, and the first thing I do is I reach my hand out, right? And then I feel like a fool. I feel like my doctor. It's like, okay, I mean, sorry, because he has no hand to reach out. And literally, we met for about an hour and a half, and for at least the first 40 minutes, I was tense. I didn't know how to relate. I didn't know how to behave. And then finally, I started relaxing a little bit. So that happens to most of us in some fashion. When we're in a group where we count, this is what a friend of mine, Claude Steele, says, when do we count? I walk into a store, a restaurant, and there's no other, maybe I don't see, there's one other black person. I'm counting. It's like, listen, oh, hey, buddy. Great to see you. Black power. But women, I mean, it happens across all. I have a friend who went down and gave a talk in Silicon Valley. He's about my age, and he said he's looking for the old people. It's like everybody was 10 years old. It's like, isn't there somebody else over 40 here? So when we talk about critical mass and dealing with this, we're talking about a situation where we no longer have to count. I'm not counting the women here. I'm not counting the black people here. It's really a diverse group. It's inclusive enough that I'm not counting. But when there's one or two, we count. And that counting creates disquiet, dis-ease, anxiety, not just in the targeted group, but sometime in the dominant group as well. So again, there's stress related to diversity. It doesn't mean that it's bad, but it means we have to deal with it. We have to hold it in a cell. We have to find a way of talking about it. We have to make sure our structures are consistent. So I'm going to end. Gail, I'm going to end. So 2 things I want to leave with you. Something I call targeted universalism, which is that we have universal goals, but targeted strategies based on how we're situated differently within structures. We have to be aware of the universal goals. The goals is not for us to get what white people have. That's not a universal goal. So when we talk about disparities, we're actually talking about getting what the dominant group has. But actually to say, what is our universal goal? What is it that we all want? And the way to get there is not to treat everybody the same. The way to get there is to realize that because people are situated differently, they will need different things to get there. That's one way of talking about race. So I have a lot of things here in terms of prescription for dealing with implicit bias, but I'm basically out of time. So I want to leave a few things with you. So addressing implicit bias, addressing these structural biases, does not mean just having dinner together, eating each other's food. I'm not against that, at least if the food is good. The thing is, can we have targets? Can we have mechanisms? Can we have processes? And evaluate ourselves in relationship to those, to be very deliberate. And I know you're doing a lot of that here in Western Michigan, but I want to applaud that and say, keep doing it. And when there's difficulty, finding space to talk about it, and not just about what we're doing, but what our structures are doing. And I'll leave you with this one example, which is not something I would recommend. I was talking to Rachel about this. They're finding that in employment, employers are not hiring blacks at the same rate as other groups because they believe blacks are likely to be using drugs. So some employers are actually using drug tests. And they actually find that using drug tests has actually a positive influence in terms of the hiring of blacks, because lo and behold, blacks don't use any more drugs than whites. But this is unconscious perception that was affecting the hiring process. I'm not suggesting that we all implement drug tests. I think that's a crude way of actually dealing with implicit bias. But it shows when you take discretion out and create these mechanisms, you can have a different set of outcomes. So there's a lot that I didn't get to say, but I'm sure my group of friends and this all-star team will say it somewhere during the day. Thank you.